Welcome to History Before Bed. Tonight's bedtime story is on ancient Greece's Mycenaean era. We hope to lull you to sleep as you relax and imagine pieces of history. Good night. In the echoes of history, the lives of ordinary people often brushed against the extraordinary. While some characters in this story are born from imagination, others, like Odysseus, Agamemnon, and Achilles, are drawn directly from the pages of the past. Together, they create a narrative that blends the real with the fictional, offering a glimpse into what could have happened during the fateful days of the Trojan War and the perilous journey home. Through their trials and triumphs, the story explores the timeless themes of heroism, sacrifice, and the enduring pull of home. Chapter 1: The Lion Gates of Mycenae. The air was thick with the scent of dust and salt as Antimenes made his way toward the citadel, the towering lion gates rising before him like a monument to the gods themselves. Each step he took along the uneven stone road brought him closer to the immense structure, its twin lions carved into the massive limestone lintel above the gate, their heads turned outwards as if eternally guarding the city. He had passed through these gates many times, yet the sheer size and craftsmanship always gave him pause. The lions seemed alive, their eyes following the comings and goings of the Mycenaean people. He adjusted the scrolls tucked under his arm, parchments detailing shipments of olive oil and bronze ingots destined for the palace workshops. As a young scribe and occasional trader, Antimenes had learned to navigate the complex system of trade that sustained Mycenae's prosperity. But today was different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something grander was in motion, and it was not just the bustling markets or the clanging of bronze smiths that filled the streets. Above him, the imposing cyclopean walls stretched toward the sky, each stone so massive it was said only giants could have lifted them. Antimenes tilted his head back, marveling at the skill of those who had built this fortress. These walls had stood for generations, guarding the kingdom and its treasures, a silent witness to the rise of Mycenae's power in the Aegean. As he walked, the sounds of the city swirled around him, traders haggling over fine ceramics and oil, the low murmur of priests chanting prayers to Poseidon and Zeus, and the ever-present hammering of weapons being forged for the upcoming campaign. Antimenes made his way through the bustling crowd, his gaze briefly caught by a group of warriors gathered near the palace entrance. Their bronze armor gleamed under the midday sun, their helmets adorned with horsehair crests swaying gently in the wind. They were preparing for war, sharpening their swords and checking their shields, their faces set with grim determination. Mycenae was preparing to march, and all knew their destination, Troy, across the Aegean Sea. The grand palace of Agamemnon loomed ahead, its gleaming facade adorned with frescoes depicting scenes of battle and victory. This was the heart of Mycenae, where power pulsed like the lifeblood of the kingdom. Antimenes stepped through the entrance, the cool shadow of the palace engulfing him, a stark contrast to the heat outside. The halls echoed with the footsteps of courtiers and officials, their whispers blending with the faint sound of lyres played in distant chambers. Inside the council chamber, Agamemnon sat, surrounded by his advisors. The king was a formidable figure, his presence commanding the room even in silence. His broad shoulders were draped in a cloak of royal purple, and a gold diadem crowned his brow, glinting in the flickering light of the oil lamps. Antimenes stood at the edge of the room, careful to stay unnoticed as the king's voice rumbled low, discussing strategy with his generals. Maps of the Aegean were spread out before them, their lines tracing the route of the fleet that would soon set sail for Troy. The war was not yet upon them, but the preparations were well underway. Agamemnon's voice grew sharper as he gestured toward the map, his eyes hardening at the mention of Troy. The chamber was filled with the symbols of Mycenae's wealth and power: golden masks from the tombs of kings, ivory carvings from distant lands, and bronze weapons that glittered in the dim light. The treasures of the Bronze Age kingdom, amassed over decades of conquest and trade, were a testament to its reach. Antimenes' eyes wandered to the intricate designs carved into the wooden beams above him, the details telling stories of victories past and gods appeased. Every surface seemed to gleam with the richness of Mycenae's spoils, but it was the golden masks, so lifelike yet eternal, that drew his attention the most. They seemed to stare back at him, as if the spirits of the dead still lingered within the palace walls. Antimenes' attention shifted back to Agamemnon as the king rose from his seat. The council had ended, the decision made. The fleet would soon sail for Troy. Stepping out of the chamber, Antimenes felt the weight of history pressed down on him, the sense that he was living in a moment that would be remembered long after his own time had passed. The streets outside bustled on, the preparations for war continuing without pause. But to Antimenes, the world seemed to move a little slower, as if even the city itself was holding its breath. As he left the palace and made his way back through the lion gates, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, Antimenes looked once more at the stone lions above him. They seemed as eternal as the walls they guarded, a symbol of Mycenae's enduring strength. Yet even they could not predict what the coming war would bring. Chapter 2: Gathering the Kings of Greece. The air at Aulis was thick with the scent of the sea, mingling with the sweat of men and the sharp tang of fresh-cut wood. Odysseus stood at the shore, his eyes narrowing as he watched the crews haul ropes and fit planks, their hands moving swiftly over the skeletal frames of ships still under construction. The sound of hammer on wood echoed across the bay, where the ships of 100 kings bobbed gently on the azure waters. Long, sleek vessels, their hulls coated in dark resin, awaited the final push into the waves. Masts rose like forest trees, their rigging snapping in the wind. Odysseus sighed. He had delayed his arrival as long as he could, hoping that the inevitable might somehow be avoided. But now here he was, standing among the great lords of Greece, his mind churning with thoughts that had little to do with the glory of battle. His heart was back in Ithaca, with Penelope and young Telemachus. The quiet life of his island had always suited him better than this. War was for men like Agamemnon and Achilles, those who lived for the clash of swords and the spilling of blood. But Odysseus was different. He was a man of cunning, a man who preferred the twist of words to the thrust of a spear. He turned at the sound of footsteps on the gravel behind him. It was Menelaus, his face drawn tight with anger, his eyes bright with a fire that had not dimmed since the day Helen was taken. He approached Odysseus, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, as though he expected at any moment to draw it against an enemy. "Odysseus," Menelaus greeted him, his voice rough as the waves crashing on the shore. "You've come at last." Odysseus forced a smile. How could I refuse such an invitation? The kings of Greece gathered for war. Who could stay away? Menelaus's jaw tightened. This war is no game, Odysseus. You know why we are here. My honor, our honor, has been stolen by Paris, by the Trojans. Helen must be returned, and Troy must fall. Odysseus nodded, though he said nothing. He understood Menelaus's rage, but he questioned whether the price of this war would be worth the cost. Helen was beautiful, of course. She was famed for it across the known world. But was she worth the blood that would surely be spilled in her name? He had seen such quests for honor before, and they rarely ended as the heroes imagined. They were joined soon by Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, his hair silvered by time, though his stride was still firm. He had seen many wars, Nestor, and he spoke often of the lessons they held. Yet even he seemed eager for this conflict, his eyes gleaming as he surveyed the growing fleet. "It is good that you have come, Odysseus," he said, his voice warm with approval. "The kings of Greece need your wisdom as much as we need Achilles' strength or Agamemnon's command." "Wisdom," Odysseus muttered under his breath, "is a rare thing in the face of war." From a distance, the sound of men shouting grew louder. Achilles strode toward them, his bronze armor gleaming in the late afternoon sun. His presence alone was enough to silence those around him. His blonde hair, bound back, caught the light, and his youthful face was set in grim determination. If there was one among them who relished the coming war, it was Achilles. He had no need for cunning or caution. His was the strength of the gods, and he would gladly prove it against the walls of Troy. "Odysseus," Achilles greeted him with a nod. "You may not like battle, but I hear you have a way of winning it regardless." Odysseus shrugged. "I win battles with my mind, Achilles. You win them with your sword. Together, we'll see if Troy can withstand either." Achilles grinned, a fierce and savage expression. "Let them try." The day stretched on as more kings arrived, their ships crowding the harbor, their warriors assembling in the open fields beyond. Great bonfires were lit, and sacrifices made to the gods, black bulls with sleek hides, their blood pooling in the dust as priests chanted prayers to Poseidon, asking for safe passage across the treacherous waters. The acrid scent of burning meat filled the air as the offerings rose in black smoke toward the heavens. Above all loomed Agamemnon, resplendent in his armor, his face hard as he surveyed the gathering forces. He stood at the center of this storm, his ambitions clear for all to see. Odysseus watched him from a distance, the flickering flames reflecting in his dark eyes. This war was Agamemnon's war, as much as it was Menelaus's. It was about more than Helen, more than honor. It was about power, about the riches of Troy and the dominance it would bring. And while the other kings rallied behind their cause, Odysseus wondered how many of them understood the true cost that lay ahead. The ships were nearly ready. Soon they would sail for Troy. Chapter 3. The Siege of Troy. The beaches outside Troy stretched endlessly beneath the shadow of the city's towering walls. The Greek ships, hundreds of them, lay pulled up along the shore, their curved hulls resting on the golden sand like silent beasts awaiting the signal to strike. Above them, Troy stood, an impenetrable fortress of stone, its high walls gleaming in the sun like the bones of some ancient giant. The city's gates, wrought of thick timber and reinforced with bronze, were closed tight, as though the very idea of Greek assault was laughable. Odysseus stood at the edge of the camp, watching the city with wary eyes. The wind carried with it the distant murmur of the sea and the cries of men preparing for the day's battle. The air was thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and leather, mingling with the smoke from the fires that dotted the Greek encampment. Beyond, the towers of Troy loomed over them all, defiant and immovable. This was no simple fortress of mud and wood. Troy was a marvel of engineering, its walls of solid stone rising higher than the tallest of men, with battlements that bristled with archers. King Priam, they said, ruled within, an old man wise enough to have survived 100 challenges to his throne. His sons, Hector and Paris, were the shields of the city, the warriors who would see Troy endure. Odysseus frowned, his mind already turning toward the long months, perhaps years, that stretched before them. This was not a battle to be won by strength alone. As the days passed, the Greeks settled into the grim rhythm of siege warfare. In the mornings, the clang of bronze swords and shields filled the air as the warriors sparred, preparing themselves for battle. Achilles, his armor polished and gleaming, paced like a caged lion. His hunger for battle had not dulled, though the walls of Troy offered him no chance to prove his mettle. Day after day he led raids against the Trojans, his sword cutting down those who dared venture beyond the safety of the gates. Yet each time he returned, he was more restless than before, his fury barely contained. Odysseus, for his part, watched and waited. He had no love for drawn-out battles or the glory sought by men like Achilles. He knew that brute force alone would not breach the walls of Troy. The Trojans were clever, their walls well defended. Siege warfare was not a clash of swords, but a slow, grinding process. It was a game of patience, of outlasting the enemy, of wearing them down until the inevitable surrender. Yet as he looked at the high towers of the city, Odysseus felt a nagging doubt. Troy would not fall easily. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the campfires flickered along the shore, Achilles found him by the water's edge. The warrior's face was hard, his mouth set in a tight line of frustration. "This siege is madness," Achilles growled. "We waste our strength here, hammering at walls that will not fall. What use is all this waiting? Let me take my men, storm the gates, and end this now." Odysseus looked at him, his face calm despite Achilles' obvious impatience. "And how many of your men will die for your pride, Achilles? The walls of Troy are not the walls of some nameless village. You'll throw yourself against them, and they'll break you like waves against a rock." Achilles' eyes flashed. "So we wait, like cowards? We sit here while they mock us from their towers?" "We wait," Odysseus said slowly, "until we can find a way to break them. Troy will fall, but not by the sword alone." Achilles snorted, turning his back on the sea. "Words are your weapon, Odysseus, but they will not bring this city to its knees." "Perhaps not," Odysseus conceded, "but the mind can cut deeper than any sword, if wielded well." The uneasy alliance between them continued, with Achilles leading his raids and Odysseus plotting quietly, his sharp eyes ever on the city. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The Greeks built their siege engines, tall wooden towers to scale the walls, battering rams with bronze-tipped heads to break the gates. They dug trenches, erected palisades, and brought their chariots to the front lines, where the thundering wheels churned up the dust of the plains before Troy. The battles were fierce, each day a blood-soaked contest for the narrow strip of land between the Greek camp and the walls. Bronze swords clashed against shields, and the cries of dying men filled the air. Chariots sped across the field, their riders standing tall as their horses charged through the dust, flanking the Trojan forces and cutting down stragglers with brutal efficiency. Archers lined the walls of Troy, their arrows raining down upon the Greeks, while stones the size of a man's head were hurled from catapults, crushing shields and men alike. Yet the walls of Troy stood firm, and each night the gates remained closed. Inside the camp, the strain of the siege began to wear on the men. Supplies were stretched thin, and the warriors, once eager for battle, now found themselves trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of skirmishes that led nowhere. Achilles grew more distant, his eyes darkening with the frustration of unrealized glory. Even the most hardened soldiers began to question how long they could endure. For the Trojans, the strain was no less. Within the city, they too grew weary of the endless assault. The once proud defenders found themselves looking out from their battlements at an enemy that refused to retreat. King Priam, it was said, held council daily with his sons, searching for a way to end the siege. But neither side gave ground. As the months dragged on, Odysseus remained ever watchful. The weight of war hung heavy over the Greek camp, yet he knew that in time something would break. Troy's walls were strong, its people resilient, but no siege could last forever. He glanced again at Achilles, restless as ever, and wondered if it would be the city or its attackers that crumbled first. Chapter 4: The Quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon. The Greek camp simmered with unrest, a subtle tension weaving through the air like smoke from the morning fires. Odysseus had felt it for days now, a storm brewing just beyond the horizon, and he knew it would soon break. At the heart of it stood Achilles and Agamemnon, their tempers fraying as the endless grind of the siege wore on them all. This war, so boldly begun, had dragged into a stalemate, and with it, the patience of the kings had frayed like worn leather. Yet, it was not the walls of Troy that threatened to undo them now. It was the fragile egos of the leaders themselves. The quarrel erupted, as so often these things did, over something seemingly small. Briseis, a captive woman taken as a spoil of war, had been given to Achilles, a prize for his prowess in battle. But Agamemnon, ever eager to assert his dominance, had demanded her for himself after being forced to surrender his own prize. It was an insult that no man of honor could endure, least of all Achilles, who stood now before the assembled kings, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think to take her from me?" Achilles' voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. He stood tall, his bronze armor gleaming in the midday sun, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as though daring anyone to challenge him. "I, who have fought and bled for this army, while you sit in your tent and count your spoils?" Agamemnon, seated upon a makeshift throne of wood and bronze, narrowed his eyes, his face, flushed with anger, twisted in a sneer. "You forget yourself, Achilles. I am the leader of this host, and you are but one among many. If I choose to take Briseis, I will do so, and you will submit as you must." The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken threat. The other kings shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between the two men. Achilles, his pride wounded beyond endurance, stood rigid, his chest heaving as he fought to control the rage that threatened to consume him. Submit? Achilles spat the word as though it burned his tongue. Never. Not to you, Agamemnon, nor to any man. Take her if you dare, but know this, I will no longer fight for you. Let your armies falter. Let the Trojans drive you into the sea. Without me, you are nothing. With those words, Achilles turned on his heel and strode from the tent, his face dark with anger, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence he left behind. Odysseus, watching from the edge of the gathering, sighed inwardly. This was the moment he had feared, the unraveling of their alliance. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, had withdrawn from the fight, and without him the army would falter. Yet it was more than just Achilles' strength that they needed. It was the unity that his presence inspired. If he remained apart, the fragile bonds between the kings would soon fray, and the war would be lost. As the others dispersed, Odysseus approached Agamemnon, whose face remained set in a scowl. The king's arrogance had always been his weakness, but now it threatened to undo everything they had fought for. "You've made a dangerous enemy today, Agamemnon," Odysseus said softly, his tone measured. "Achilles will not be easily swayed once his pride is wounded." Agamemnon's eyes flicked toward him, hard and unyielding. "He is but one man. I will not be cowed by his tantrums. Let him sulk in his tent if he wishes." Odysseus shook his head, stepping closer so that only Agamemnon could hear him. "You know as well as I do that without Achilles, our chances grow dim. The Trojans sense weakness. They will press their advantage. This war is about more than pride, Agamemnon. It is about survival." The king glared at him for a moment, but said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin line. Odysseus knew that pride had taken root too deeply in Agamemnon's heart for him to yield so easily. The Greek king believed in the strength of his position, but Odysseus could already feel the consequences unfolding. The days that followed were grim. The Trojans, emboldened by Achilles' absence, pressed harder against the Greek lines. Hector, Priam's eldest son, led the charge, his spear cutting through the ranks of Greek warriors with brutal efficiency. Without Achilles at the head of the army, the Greeks faltered, their lines buckling under the relentless assault. Chariots sped across the plains, kicking up clouds of dust, while the clash of bronze against bronze echoed across the battlefield. Men fell beneath the onslaught, their bodies piling up like driftwood along the shore. Inside the camp, morale plummeted. The warriors whispered of Achilles' refusal to fight, their faith in victory slipping through their fingers like sand. Each day, the toll of battle grew heavier, and the scent of death hung thick in the air. Even the gods, it seemed, had turned their gaze from the Greek cause. Odysseus moved through the camp like a shadow, speaking quietly with the other kings, urging them to hold the line, to keep the coalition from crumbling. Yet he knew that without Achilles, they could not hope to win. The fragile alliances that held the Greek army together were built on personal honor and pride, and those bonds had begun to fray. In the evenings, as the fires flickered and the men ate their meager rations, Odysseus would sit by his own fire, his mind churning with thoughts of how to repair the breach. Achilles was a proud man, but he was not unreachable. Yet for now, he remained in his tent, silent and brooding, while the war raged on without him. One night, as Odysseus sat watching the flames dance, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, his face lined with age, but his eyes still sharp. "You have the ear of many, Odysseus," Nestor said, lowering himself to the ground beside him. "But this quarrel, it may be beyond even your talents to mend." Odysseus nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "Pride is a powerful thing, Nestor, but so is necessity. Achilles will not fight for Agamemnon, not now, but he will fight for Greece. We need only find the way." Nestor smiled faintly, though the weariness of war showed in his eyes. "If anyone can find the way, it is you, but I fear time is not on our side." As the old king rose and walked away, Odysseus remained by the fire, his thoughts heavy. He knew that the key to winning this war lay not in the strength of their swords, but in the fragile balance of pride and honor that held their alliance together. And until that balance was restored, the Greeks would continue to falter, and the walls of Troy would remain unbroken. Chapter 5: The Fall of Troy. The night air outside Troy was still, unnaturally quiet after the long years of war that had scarred this land. The Greek camp, which had stood for nearly a decade along the shores, was empty now. Its ships, once so numerous, had vanished from the bay. To the Trojans, it seemed as if the gods had finally answered their prayers. The Greeks were gone, and the war at last was over. At the gates of Troy stood a massive wooden horse, towering above the heads of the soldiers who gathered to inspect it. It had been left behind by the Greeks as a parting gift, or so it seemed. The Trojans, eager to celebrate their victory, saw it not as a trick, but as a tribute to their endurance. They had survived the might of Greece, withstood the siege, and now their city remained unbroken. In their joy, they opened the gates and hauled the wooden colossus into their city, the sound of its wheels grinding against the cobblestones echoing through the streets. Odysseus, hidden deep within the belly of the horse alongside his chosen warriors, listened as the cheers of the Trojans faded. The cramped, dark space stank of sweat and fear, though none of the men dared speak. They knew what was at stake. The plan had been simple, conceived in a moment of inspiration by Odysseus, yet it required more than mere cunning. It demanded the patience of a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had spent hours inside the hollow wooden beast, waiting for night to fall, for the Trojans to sleep, lulled into security by their imagined victory. The night stretched on, endless in its silence, broken only by the distant sounds of celebration within the city. At last, Odysseus signaled his men. With slow, deliberate movements, they pried open the hidden hatch and slipped out one by one into the cool night air. Around them, Troy slept, its defenders weary from their long years of war, its walls unguarded in the shadow of their false triumph. Odysseus moved quickly, his heart beating in his chest like a war drum. He had never been one for brute force, but tonight it was necessary. Tonight Troy would fall, and his plan, his mind, would be the cause of it. He and his men made their way to the gates, their steps soundless on the cobblestone streets. The gates, which had stood closed and invulnerable for so long, were now a mere obstacle to be removed. The hinges groaned softly as they swung open, and in the distance Odysseus saw the waiting figures of the Greek army moving like shadows through the night. Their ships, hidden just beyond the horizon, had returned under cover of darkness, bringing the full might of the Greeks back to the shores of Troy. With a single silent signal, Odysseus gave the order. The Greeks poured into the city like a wave, their swords flashing in the moonlight, their shields raised high. The streets, which had once echoed with the sounds of commerce and life, now rang with the clash of bronze on bronze, the screams of the dying, and the roar of flames as buildings caught fire. The Trojans, roused from their sleep, rushed to defend their homes, but it was too late. The Greeks were everywhere, their victory swift and brutal. Odysseus watched as the city fell around him, his face a mask of grim determination. Troy, the city of legend, was burning. The palaces that had once stood as symbols of power and wealth were reduced to smoldering ruins. The gates that had withstood 10 years of siege now lay shattered, their timbers splintered beneath the weight of Greek swords. Men fought and died in the streets, their blood staining the cobblestones. Women and children fled, their cries rising into the night like the wails of lost souls. In the heart of the city, King Priam's palace was consumed by fire. Priam himself, the once great king, had been cut down where he stood, his blood pooling at the feet of the statue of Zeus that had watched over his reign. Paris, whose abduction of Helen had sparked this war, lay dead among the ruins, his lifeless body sprawled in the dust. Hector's ghost, it seemed, had finally been avenged. Amid the chaos, Odysseus moved like a specter, his eyes taking in the destruction with a cold, calculating gaze. He had always known the cost of victory would be high, but seeing it unfold before him brought no satisfaction. Troy had fallen, as he had always known it would, but the price, the lives lost, the city burning, hung heavy on him. This was the fruit of war, not glory, but ashes and blood. As the fires raged, Odysseus found himself standing on the walls of Troy, looking out over the city that had once seemed so invincible. The flames licked at the sky, casting flickering shadows across the landscape, and the scent of smoke and death filled the air. The roar of the battle still echoed in his ears, but all he felt was an overwhelming sense of weariness. Behind him, the Greek warriors surged through the city, sacking the palaces, seizing treasures, and taking captives. But Odysseus stood apart, his mind far away. He had won, Troy had fallen, but at what cost? The city was in ruins, and so too were the lives of those who had fought and died for this moment. There would be no peace, no true victory. The gods themselves had watched this war unfold, and they would demand their own reckoning. He knew that his journey was far from over. Though Troy lay in ashes, the war had only just begun for him. The road ahead was long, and its dangers greater than any he had faced on these shores. As the dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Troy, Odysseus turned away from the walls. He had done what he had come to do, but the weight of his deeds hung heavy upon him. War, he realized, was not won with swords or cunning alone. It was won through sacrifice, through the loss of everything one held dear. And in the end, victory tasted of ashes. Chapter 6: The Return of Odysseus. The sea stretched out before Odysseus, an endless expanse of blue that shimmered beneath the midday sun. The Greek ships, their sails full with the wind, cut through the waves with practiced ease. The men, eager to return home after so many years of war, worked silently, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Yet as they sailed, Odysseus felt a deep unease settle over him, like the calm before a storm. He knew too well that the gods did not allow men to escape their fates so easily, and he of all men had angered the gods. Poseidon, the lord of the sea, had not forgotten the blinding of his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Odysseus knew that the path home would not be a simple one. As he stood at the bow of the ship, the wind tugging at his cloak, He felt the weight of the coming trials as though they pressed upon him from every direction. His mind turned, as it always did, to Ithaca, to the rocky shores of his homeland, and to Penelope and Telemachus. How many years had passed since he had last seen them? The memories had grown dim in the fog of war, yet the longing remained sharp as ever, driving him forward. But it was not long before the gods reminded him of their displeasure. The first sign came quietly, a subtle shift in the air, the sky darkening as clouds gathered overhead. The sea, which had been calm moments before, began to churn beneath the hull of the ship. Odysseus narrowed his eyes, watching as the waves grew larger, the wind rising in a furious gust. From the depths of the horizon, a wall of black clouds surged forward, and the sea itself seemed to roar in anger. Poseidon was here. The storm struck with a fury only the gods could summon. The waves crashed against the ship, sending torrents of water spilling over the sides. The men shouted as they scrambled to secure the sails, their faces pale with fear. But there was no escaping the wrath of the sea. Lightning split the sky, and the wind howled like a beast tearing at the ship's rigging. The vessel heaved beneath them, tossed about like driftwood in the hands of a vengeful god. For days they were driven off course, their ship battered and broken, until at last they found themselves washed ashore on a strange land. The air was sweet here, the scent of flowers drifting on the breeze, and the sun shone warmly down upon them. Exhausted, the men dragged themselves onto the shore, grateful for the respite. Yet Odysseus, ever cautious, felt a deep suspicion stirring within him. This place was too perfect, too peaceful. As they explored the island, they came upon a strange group of people, the Lotus Eaters. These gentle souls offered food to the weary sailors, fruits that looked like golden honey. Many of the men, hungry and weary, accepted the offering eagerly, but soon Odysseus saw the danger. Those who ate the lotus became sluggish, their eyes glazed over, as though they had forgotten the war, their homes, their very names. They wanted only to stay, to eat more of the lotus, to remain in this dreamlike haze forever. Odysseus, realizing the trap, moved quickly. He tore the fruit from the hands of his men, dragging them back to the ship as they protested weakly. It was a hard fight, harder than any battle, but eventually he gathered them all, tying those who resisted to the benches of the ship until they came to their senses. They sailed away from the land of the Lotus Eaters, leaving behind the sweet smell of oblivion. But Odysseus knew the worst was yet to come. As they sailed on, the journey became a relentless trial. The gods threw one challenge after another in their path, testing Odysseus's wits, his patience, and his leadership. They encountered the treacherous lair of Scylla and Charybdis, the twin monsters that lurked in a narrow strait. On one side, Scylla, a many-headed creature who lurked in the cliffs, waiting to snatch men from the decks of their ships. On the other, Charybdis, a vast whirlpool that threatened to swallow the entire ship whole. Odysseus knew there was no perfect escape. He had to choose between Scylla's jaws or Charybdis's maw. Grimly, he steered the ship closer to Scylla, hoping to minimize the loss of life. As they passed, the beast struck, her heads darting down from the cliffs, snatching 6 of his men before disappearing into the darkness. Their screams echoed in the ears of those who remained, but there was no time for mourning. Charybdis roared on the other side, its swirling waters threatening to pull them into its depths, and Odysseus had to keep his course steady or risk losing everything. The loss of his men weighed heavily on him, but Odysseus knew he could not show weakness. His men looked to him for strength, for guidance, and he had no choice but to lead. The sea had become a battlefield, one where brute strength meant nothing. It was his mind that would carry them home, if they could make it at all. For all his cunning, for all his strength, Odysseus found himself tested in ways he had never imagined. His body ached with exhaustion, and his heart longed for Ithaca, but the gods seemed determined to delay his return. And yet, no matter how many times they were blown off course, no matter how many men he lost to the perils of the sea, Odysseus pressed on. He had fought through 10 years of war, and now this voyage, cursed as it was, had become a new kind of test. A test of endurance, of character, of will. Each night, as the ship sailed on, Odysseus would stand at the bow and look out over the sea, his mind filled with thoughts of home. He pictured Penelope, her patient hands weaving at the loom, waiting for his return. He imagined Telemachus, now nearly a man, standing on the cliffs of Ithaca, watching the horizon for a ship that had been gone far too long. These thoughts sustained him, kept him moving forward, even when the journey seemed endless. But deep down, Odysseus knew that this was not just about returning home. The gods had cast him adrift, not simply as punishment for his cleverness, but as a test of the man he was. War had tested his strength, but this journey, this long, cursed voyage, was a test of his soul. Would he be the same man who left Ithaca all those years ago, or had the gods already shaped him into something new, something harder, more enduring? As the ship sailed on into the unknown, Odysseus knew there was no turning back. The road to Ithaca was long and fraught with danger, but he would find his way home, or die trying. Chapter 7. Ithaca in Ruins. Odysseus stood on the shores of Ithaca, the salty breeze tugging at his worn cloak, the familiar scent of the sea mingling with the earth of his homeland. It had been so many years since he had last stood on this soil that he almost did not recognize it. Yet there it was, his Ithaca. The place that had haunted his dreams during long nights on foreign seas. His heart ached as he surveyed the rocky cliffs and olive groves that stretched across the island. The joy he had expected upon his return was tempered by what lay ahead. This was no homecoming of peace. Ithaca had changed, and so too had he. Disguised as a beggar, his hair streaked with gray and his once strong body bent by the trials of his long journey, Odysseus moved quietly toward the palace that had once been his own. From the hilltop, he could see its towering walls, but the sight filled him with sorrow rather than pride. The great halls that had once rung with laughter, with the voices of his men and the songs of feasts, now sat sullied by the presence of suitors, men who had come to plunder what was not theirs. These suitors, bold in their belief that Odysseus was long dead, had overrun his palace. They courted Penelope, filling the hall with their arrogance and greed, vying for the right to claim her hand, and with it, his kingdom. They feasted every night, slaughtering his cattle, draining his stores of wine, while his son Telemachus watched in growing frustration, too young to challenge them openly, but old enough to feel the weight of his father's absence. Odysseus slipped through the back streets of Ithaca, his cloak pulled tightly around him, his once proud bearing hidden beneath the guise of a weary traveler. He passed villagers who did not recognize him, who had once sung his praises and spoken of his bravery, but now moved on with their lives, resigned to the belief that their king would never return. His heart clenched with anger, but he pressed on, knowing that his time to reveal himself had not yet come. At last he reached the palace. He stood at the gates for a long moment, gazing at the stone walls, worn by the years yet still standing. The sound of laughter and the clatter of dishes came from within, and he could hear the loud voices of the suitors, their boastful declarations and cruel jests ringing through the halls. His home had become a den of thieves. The once proud halls of Ithaca were filled with strangers who disrespected his legacy, and Odysseus felt the weight of his absence like a wound reopening. He slipped inside unnoticed, blending into the shadows like a wraith, his eyes scanning the hall as he moved. There they were, the suitors, lounging on couches, their hands full of meat and wine, their mouths full of brags and jeers. His heart burned with anger, but he held it in check. He would not rush into this recklessly. He had waited too long, endured too much to lose everything now. From across the hall he saw a familiar face, Telemachus. His son had grown, no longer the child he had left behind, but a young man, his features hardened by years of frustration and longing. Telemachus carried himself with a quiet dignity, but Odysseus could see the tension in his frame, the barely concealed rage beneath his calm exterior. He knew his son had been waiting for this moment as much as he had, and together they would reclaim what had been taken from them. Later, in the quiet of the servants' quarters, Odysseus revealed himself to Telemachus. The shock and disbelief on his son's face quickly gave way to joy, and the two embraced, their reunion bittersweet after so many years of separation. But there was little time for celebration. The suitors had grown too comfortable, too arrogant, and now it was time to strike. "We must be careful," Odysseus warned, his voice low. "These men are many, and they are ruthless. But they are also overconfident. We will use that against them." Telemachus nodded, his face set with determination. "I have waited for this day, father. Tell me what to do." Together, they devised a plan. With the help of a few loyal servants who had kept faith even in the king's long absence, they prepared for the final confrontation. Odysseus, ever the master of deception, would remain in his beggar's disguise, slipping unnoticed among the suitors as they feasted. Telemachus would gather the weapons, stashing them in a hidden room so that when the moment came, the suitors would find themselves unarmed and helpless. As night fell, Odysseus moved through the hall, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He listened to the suitors as they boasted of their victories in battle, their prowess with the bow, their strength in arms. They mocked the absent king, laughing at the thought that a man who had been gone so long could ever return to reclaim what was his. Odysseus smiled to himself, his anger cold and controlled. These men knew nothing of what awaited them. Penelope, his beloved wife, sat in the corner of the hall, her face a mask of patience. She had played her part well, keeping the suitors at bay with promises and delaying tactics, always holding out hope that her husband would return. Yet even she had begun to doubt, her heart heavy with the years of waiting. She did not recognize Odysseus in his disguise, but he saw the flicker of pain in her eyes as she looked at the men who would take her away from everything she had fought to protect. The next day, Penelope announced the contest of the bow, a test that only Odysseus could pass. She knew that none of the suitors would be able to string his great bow, a weapon of such strength that it required not just muscle, but skill. One by one, the suitors failed, their arrogance turning to frustration as they struggled to bend the bow. And then, in his beggar's rags, Odysseus stepped forward. The hall fell silent as he lifted the bow, his movements steady and sure. In one fluid motion, he strung it, the familiar feel of the weapon in his hands bringing a surge of strength through his body. He pulled back the string and released, the arrow flying true, piercing the target with ease. For a heartbeat, the hall remained still, the suitors staring in disbelief. And then, with a voice like thunder, Odysseus revealed himself. "I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca, returned at last." The suitors scrambled for weapons, but Telemachus was ready. The doors were barred, the weapons gone. With the help of his loyal servants, Odysseus struck down the suitors one by one, reclaiming his home with the same skill and cunning that had carried him through the long years of war and wandering. At last, the halls of Ithaca were silent, the suitors lying dead at Odysseus's feet. The kingdom was his again, but as he looked around at the blood-stained floor, the broken furniture, and the faces of those who had suffered in his absence, Odysseus felt the heavy toll that the years had taken. Ithaca was his, but it would never be the same. Chapter 8: The Bow of Odysseus. The great hall of Ithaca's palace was thick with the tension of anticipation, the air heavy with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. The suitors, bloated with arrogance and indulgence, lounged in their seats, unaware of the storm about to break over them. The hearth flickered with a low fire, casting long shadows across the stone walls. It was a scene of reckless excess, far from the order and discipline that once defined Odysseus's home. Yet at its heart, beneath the layers of decay, Ithaca's spirit lingered, waiting for the moment of reckoning. In the center of the hall, Penelope sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes watching the suitors as they bickered and boasted. Her face was calm, but her heart was heavy. The contest of the bow, the test that she had devised, was nearing its conclusion, and none of the suitors had come close to mastering Odysseus's great bow. One after another they had tried and failed, their faces turning red with frustration as they struggled to bend the bow's mighty arc. Now the disguised Odysseus stood in their midst, his tattered cloak hanging loosely over his shoulders, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp and clear beneath the facade of age and weariness. He had watched silently as each man made a fool of himself, and now it was his turn. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the bow. The suitors jeered, their laughter ringing through the hall. "Look at the beggar," one of them sneered. "He thinks he can string the bow when we cannot." But Odysseus said nothing. His hand rested on the bow, his fingers tracing the familiar curve of the wood. It had been years since he had last held it, yet the weight felt right in his hands, as though no time had passed. The room seemed to fall away, the noise of the suitors fading into a distant hum. All that mattered now was the bow, the arrow, and the silent strength that still lay within him. With a single fluid motion, Odysseus lifted the bow. The hall fell silent, the suitors watching with widening eyes. His arms, though they appeared worn from years of wandering, moved with the precision and grace of the warrior he had always been. He bent the bow easily, as though it were a mere plaything, and strung it with a swift, practiced motion. The bow sang as it curved under the pressure of his hands, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without hesitation, Odysseus fitted an arrow to the string. He drew it back, his muscles moving like iron beneath the cloak of age, and aimed toward the line of 12 axe heads set up at the far end of the hall. His eyes narrowed, his focus absolute. He released the arrow, and it flew straight and true, whistling through the air with deadly purpose. The arrow passed cleanly through the 12 axe heads, one after another, the sound of its flight echoing through the stunned silence of the hall. The suitors, who had been lounging in ease just moments before, sat frozen, their laughter cut short. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The arrow quivered in the target, a silent testament to the man who had fired it. Odysseus straightened, the cloak slipping from his shoulders, and in that moment he was no longer a beggar. He stood tall and proud, his eyes flashing with the fierce light of a king reclaiming his throne. His voice, deep and strong, rang out across the hall. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, returned at last." The suitors, their faces pale with shock, scrambled to their feet. Their arrogance had drained away, leaving only fear. They reached for their weapons, but Telemachus and the loyal servants had already hidden them, leaving the suitors defenseless. Chaos erupted as they realized their doom, but there was no escape. Odysseus moved like a force of nature, his fury controlled, his every strike deliberate. Telemachus fought by his side, his young face set in grim determination. The bond between father and son rekindled in the heat of battle. The hall, which had once been filled with the suitors' laughter, now echoed with their cries as they fell one by one under Odysseus's blade. It was over quickly. The suitors lay dead at his feet, their blood staining the stone floor of the hall that had once been his sanctuary. The quiet that followed was heavy, almost unbearable, as the flames of the hearth crackled softly in the background. The palace was his again, but it had come at a terrible cost. The years of war, the suffering of his people, and the destruction of everything he had built weighed on him now as he stood among the ruins of his kingdom. Odysseus looked at Telemachus, his son, now a man, and saw in his eyes the reflection of his own journey, the endless trials, the losses, the moments of doubt. But they had endured, and now, standing together in the hall of Ithaca, they had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. Penelope approached slowly, her face pale with disbelief. For years she had waited, hoping against hope that her husband would return, but now that he stood before her, she could hardly believe it was real. Odysseus looked into her eyes, and in that moment the weight of all that had passed melted away. He had returned. He had come home. Yet even as the joy of reunion filled the room, Odysseus felt the cold grip of reality tighten around his heart. He was home, but he was not the same man who had left Ithaca all those years ago. War had changed him, had scarred him in ways that no amount of victory could undo. The halls of Ithaca were his again, but they would never be the same. As the sun set over the island, casting long shadows across the hills and olive groves, Odysseus stood at the entrance to his palace, looking out over the land he had fought so hard to return to. The cost of war weighed heavily on him, the lives lost, the destruction wrought, the years wasted in endless battle. Power was fragile, fleeting, and Ithaca, though it had been reclaimed, would bear the scars of his absence for generations to come. But amid the ashes of war, there was also hope. The bond between father and son, the enduring strength of home and family, these were the things that could not be destroyed by time or war. Ithaca had been brought to its knees, but it had risen again, and in that there was a measure of peace. For Odysseus, the journey was over, but the lessons of war, the fragility of power, the endurance of the human spirit, would stay with him forever.